Hische Stango, Sarah Barnett, Jaho Jefkados, Muskogee Owes, Tahlequah Legados. My name is Sarah Barnett. I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Nation. I'm streaming here from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I want to welcome you to this session, which is part of the 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. This session is titled Keeping the Sage Burning, an Evaluation of Pre-Service ICWA Training for Oklahoma Foster Adoptive Parents, with our speaker, Kendra Lowden. She's Potawatomi and Osage. She works for the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. As you probably know, the session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. You can find the rest of our schedule online at nsuok.edu/symposium. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Kendra Lowden has been the foster care adoption manager at Citizen Potawatomi Nation since 2019. Prior to her current position, Kendra worked at Chickasaw Nation for almost 7 years and served as the foster care manager. Additionally, she worked at the Citizen Potawatomi Nation House of Hope for 2 years as the domestic violence prevention coordinator. She earned a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Oklahoma in 2010 and is currently attending Southeastern Oklahoma State University to obtain a Master of Science in Native American Leadership, which we were just discussing. She will finish in August of this year. So congratulations to you, Kendra. Kendra was a fellow in the 2020 Adopt Us Kids Minority Professional Leadership Development Program and conducted an in-depth research project examining Indian Child Welfare Act training for Oklahoma foster adoptive parents. She was selected to present her research at the 2021 National Indian Child Welfare Association Conference, which I think is happening now as well. Kendra also regularly trains tribal partners on how to complete home studies and has presented at the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association Conference. Her passion in Indian child welfare includes ensuring children are placed in culturally appropriate homes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker.
Gwitch, Bojo Manowabin, Kendra Loudon and Desnikas, St. Louis, Oklahoma, Nadochpia, Shawnee, Oklahoma, Indida, Jigwe Oendodum, Sexy Oendodum, Bodwadmi Quayendow, Washashi Quayendow. Said, hello, good morning. My name is Kendra Loudon. I'm from St. Louis, Oklahoma, and I currently live in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I am Potawatomi and Osage, and I am Thunder and Deer Clan. So thank you so much for joining me today. As they mentioned, my project or my presentation is Keeping the Sage Burning. And so just to go over a couple of our objectives today, I know that it's very possible that some of you may not be very familiar with Indian child welfare. And so I definitely want to talk with you about that. But we're also going to talk about the Adopt US Kids program that I graduated from this year, which is what allowed me to do this research project. We'll talk about Oklahoma foster care, the Indian Child Welfare Act training offered to foster parents in Oklahoma, the research methodology that I used to complete this project. And also you're going to get to hear from the survey respondents, which are Oklahoma foster adoptive parents. And we're going to review recommendations on how we can improve ICWA knowledge for them while having tribal state collaboration. So first, I did want to give a brief overview of the Adopt US Kids Minority Professional Leadership Development Program. It was a 12-month program. I graduated in January of 2021. And so it's really meant for emerging minority leaders who are working in child welfare. And so I am the first and only tribal child welfare worker to ever be in the program or graduate from it. But I'm hoping to see that change. And there's been one other Native American, her name's Heather, and we've actually been able to work together to do some presentations and some consulting work. So we're really excited at the opportunities the NPLD afforded us. Really the biggest part that has made an impact on me is the research project. And then I just wanted to share a few highlights. We were able to meet in DC right before the pandemic. And there's monthly small group and large group coaching for fellows. We learned about research, transformational leadership. And there's been really great networking opportunities. Like I mentioned, I've been able to talk about doing consulting work with a couple organizations so that we can help strengthen ICWA knowledge and cultural knowledge about working with Native families. And really the biggest thing too is having those relationships with my peers who, although many of us come from different backgrounds, we have a lot of commonalities as well. And so we're able to support each other and, talk about the issues that we faced during the Black Lives Matter movement that has been continuing for several years and the COVID-19 pandemic. And so here's just a few pictures from the kickoff meeting. The graduation was on Zoom, unfortunately. And then I did want to share a picture of this. So I don't know if you've ever heard of creme brulee. I actually, like I mentioned, I'm from St. Louis, Oklahoma. If you're not familiar, it's very small. It's about 150 people. We don't have restaurants. So I just wanted to share that that was like a really cool part of my trip as well. So if you are like a hillbilly like me, definitely look into this treat. And then this is just a slide. So if you are a child welfare worker or know a child welfare worker who is a minority, they can work for a state agency, a private agency, or a tribe. Please, take a picture of this, or you can email me later, and I can share this information with you. But the NPLD has been a really amazing program for my professional growth. And so now I wanted to talk about why I called my presentation Keeping the Sage Burning. So I prayed a lot about what I would name this presentation, and thought about like, what is my intent? And so when I thought about it, I was considering sage. Sage is a part of our Native American heritage. It is how that we choose to heal. And it's also how we help each other. We help each other heal. And so as a foster adoptive parent, these are really values that they should have. They should have an understanding of a child's heritage and be able to connect them to that to the best of their ability. Typically, they need support to do that. A foster adoptive parent helps a child heal from abuse and neglect that they have faced and any other traumas. And they also just help them in general, help them become a successful adult. They help them just, heal and connect to their heritage. So I wanted to share about the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, or ICWA. A lot of you may be familiar with ICWA, but I wanted to share an overview of that. So it is a federal law that was enacted in response to large numbers of American Indian children being removed from their families by state and private adoption agencies. And data found that 25 to 35% of all children were being removed unnecessarily. So basically for no good reason. Congress reviewed these studies and listened to testimony from tribes. So when the law was written, it uniquely recognizes the political status of American Indians and is not race-based. It sets guidelines for placement of Indian children and how tribes are to be notified about foster care and adoption episodes and investigations. ICWA also sets guidelines for states on how they work with families. So they have to provide what's called active efforts, which is essentially a higher level of effort to help families due to the disproportionate amount of children in care and the actions taken against tribes over the years. ICWA applies to children enrolled or eligible for enrollment in a tribe. So here I wanted to share, this is a letter from an Indian mission, and it says, "Thank you very kindly for your donation of $10 for My Little Indians." And they talk about here, the person at the mission says, "We have a few little boys and girls who no one is interested in, whether they live or die or come and go. I would send a little boy of 6 years or older or a little girl, whatever you prefer. These Indian children are very little trouble." And then they go on to say, "If you really mean it, I will see that we get him ready. You may have him anytime you desire. I'm not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did." And again, it talks about people don't care if these children come and go, live or die. We know that's not true because so many of these children were taken away forcibly for no reason. Also, $10, if you look that up today, it's about $100. And so they're just basically, you wrote a letter, you could get an Indian child given to you, and they didn't research your home. They didn't try to find your background and how you may take care of them. And so this letter is from 1952. This is just a few years after my Native American grandmother was born and a few years before my Native American father was born. And so this is not ancient history. The 50s, most people that are born in the 50s are still living today. This is our grandparents' generation for many of us. And in addition to ICWA, the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Act is a state law here. The Bureau of Indian Affairs did implement guidelines in 2016, which clarified and strengthened portions of the law. And Oklahoma Human Services is the child welfare agency here in Oklahoma, and it's also incorporated throughout their policy as well. So their workers are told that their policy is to follow ICWA. There are many issues that are facing American Indians in Oklahoma when it comes to child welfare. We have a disproportionate amount of American Indian children in foster care compared to other races, and there is a lack of ICWA compliant homes for children. And also we have limited ICWA training for foster parents. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. And then I wanted to share the statistics for the racial disproportionality in Oklahoma. There, in September 2020, there were 7,774 total children in Oklahoma foster care. And of those, 322 are in tribal custody. So many tribes are able to operate their own tribal child welfare systems and courts. And so those children, many of them did start out in state custody. We can transfer jurisdiction. So that's an important thing to know, is that many of these tribal custody children did start out in the custody of the state. And there were 2,567 total American Indian children in Oklahoma foster care. So that's 35% of the children in Oklahoma foster care are American Indian. And American Indians as a whole, of any age, only make up 9.3% of Oklahoma's population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So that is definitely the definition of disproportionality. And despite the extraordinary number of children we have in foster care here, foster parents really aren't receiving training about the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, or about tribes or the unique cultural needs that these children have when it comes to parenting them. OKDHS developed a curriculum in partnership with OU's National Resource Center for Youth Services, or NRCYS, and it's called Guiding Principles for Oklahoma Kinship, Foster, and Adoptive Families. And this is the foster parent and adoptive parent training that is used prior to a home being approved as a resource home for the state. And so this is their chance to get all the information they would need to know to appropriately care for children. And so according to the NRCYS, there was no tribal consultation that occurred before, during, or after this 27-hour training was implemented in 2012. And just as background, I did train this for 6.5 years, so I'm very familiar with the content within this curriculum. And so that definitely made it easier for me during this project. OKDHS is piloting a new curriculum called the NTDC training. It's only in Oklahoma County right now, and that will continue until next September in 2022. And after that pilot is over, then they will implement NTDC statewide with different maybe state requirements or other things that they would like to see in the curriculum. And I wanted to share, so there are trainers for the curriculum, and this is from the trainer's manual. And there's a 3-hour session called Culture and Connections. And so I'll read this here. Before we conclude our discussion on cultural guides, they want to bring to the attention important DHS policy on culture and religion. So basically, foster and adoptive parents have to support the religious beliefs of children, so they point that out. And then also 2 federal laws that were designed to ensure children in care are placed in culturally appropriate homes. And the participants are directed to look in their handbook and look after the session, and also discuss questions with their child's worker. So the words Indian child welfare are never stated within this curriculum. Again, we have such a large number of children in care. So it's definitely, you know, a need that's been identified. And the training manual is 349 pages. And this is what is in the participant handbook. This is what the trainer tells the foster adoptive parent to look at. And really, ICWA definitely covers a lot more than these 3 things, which are eligibility, placement preferences, and the purpose of ICWA. There's really a lot more parts of ICWA and tenets to ICWA that a foster parent would need to know to really understand how a case is going to go for a child they're caring for. So for my research question, it was for Oklahoma foster adoptive parents, is their pre-service training sufficient to care for and culturally support the American Indian children they foster and adopt, and help them understand the tenets of the ICWA? And so with my question, I decided I'm going to go directly to the source, and we are going to survey foster and adoptive parents in Oklahoma who are approved through DHS. So these are not tribally approved foster homes, although some are Native American. These are homes who work directly with the State Department. So I did use surveys to collect the data, and it was anonymous so that they would feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and opinions. There were over 3,000 email invitations sent, and I had a response rate of 308, which was pretty good considering there wasn't an incentive for this, and foster parents are very busy and may not have even seen the email. So I felt pretty good about that. And so in Oklahoma, you can be approved as a foster home, an adoptive home, a therapeutic home, or a contracted home, or a combination of them. And so these families have experience in these different areas. And I did have to get IRB approval through OKDHS, which was a new thing for me because in my undergraduate and graduate work, I have not had to do that. And so because I used human subjects, and they were very helpful at DHS to help me with my research proposal, and we were able to get that approved, and I had to have their support. So this is just a screenshot from the survey. So I did have to do an informed consent. So this is just like really any researcher would do. I had to follow the steps, except I'm not a researcher by trade or education. So the demographics, so of my 308 respondents, we had 70% who were Caucasian, 16% who were American Indian, 6% who were Black or African American, and then a smaller percent of the other race and ethnicities. And so as you can see, 83% of the respondents are non-Native. And so in a conversation I had with the Assistant Child Welfare Director at OKDHS, she said these numbers are pretty representative of foster adoptive parents as a whole. So that was really exciting to see that these respondents really are gonna cover what we think may be statewide, the type of responses we may see. So 90% of the respondents are current foster homes, and 66% are approved to adopt. And so some are approved to do both. And we had really good experience. So with our foster homes, there was over 3,000 children they had fostered. Some families were new, so they had not yet fostered, and one family fostered 200 children. And adoption, we see high numbers for the same. We have 227 children adopted. Some families had not yet, and one family had adopted 21 children. So we have really great experience and knowledge within the survey respondents, and we can definitely see that as we move forward in sharing their thoughts and opinions. And so as far as who has fostered or adopted American Indian children, 64% of them have. And again, remember, 83% of our respondents are non-Native. So there is a large percentage of these respondents who have cared for American Indian children despite themselves not being Native. And so the number of children they fostered, it was very high. We had 697 children, and one family had fostered 21 American Indian children. And then we have 58 adopted, with 6 being the highest. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm more than happy to stop and answer those as we go. So the tribal affiliation for the children that were reported, we did have quite a few that they were not sure or they couldn't remember the tribe of the child they fostered or adopted. But of those that did, there were 36 federally recognized tribes that were included, and 31 of those were Oklahoma tribes. And so again, it's such a great sampling of experience and information that these respondents can provide. And just as a reminder, each tribe represents an individual and unique culture. So a family is cared for a Potawatomi child, that child wouldn't have the same experience as a Cherokee child. The training curriculum, and so as I mentioned before, the current curriculum is called Guiding Principles. And so most of the respondents have completed that curriculum, and then we had some who have completed other curriculums. 60% of the respondents reported 0 hours of ICWA training after their pre-service training. So after a foster adoptive parent is approved, they do have to complete 12 hours of annual training. And it can be in a variety of topics, but we have a large majority who have not had any continued ICWA training. And the trainings on the previous slide don't really offer ICWA information. So essentially they've had none even after approval. And then we did have some, 28% who had 1 to 3 hours, and then a smaller percentage who had more than 4 hours. So to test the knowledge of the respondents about ICWA, I thought it would be important to give 5 simple true or false questions. It wasn't meant to trick them. I just wanted to see, 50-50 chance there to answer correctly. Like, what do they know about ICWA? And so these, if I were to give a 2-minute speech on ICWA, these 5 questions are topics that I would cover about ICWA. And so overall, we did have a failing quiz score. And so the respondents scored an average of 53. We did have a couple hundreds, and we had several zeros as well. So definitely the 53 was pretty representative. Most people missed 2 or 3 questions. The first is true or false. ICWA is a law enacted in 1978 in response to a crisis affecting American Indian and Alaska Native children, families, and tribes. And that answer is true. So we had a really great success rate on this question. And ICWA is a law based on race. The answer is false. As I mentioned, Indian status is not racial, but it's political, and that is a matter of law. We are not considered a racial group like other races, such as African Americans or Latinos, but rather a government like the state of Oklahoma when it comes to our relationship with the law. And again, our government is unique because of its culture and history, and the political status of tribes have been affirmed over hundreds of years through treaties and engagements among governments and by the Supreme Court rulings. And so that was, we had 72% who answered that wrong. And so that stands out to me as a misrepresentation or just maybe a miseducation about the law. ICWA requires states to place American Indian children in certain types of placements. The answer is true, and people seem to mostly know that that was correct. And I'm sorry, that's supposed to say 17%. And so ICWA only applies to American Indian children who are enrolled as a tribe. As I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, ICWA applies to children who are enrolled or eligible for enrollment. And so an Indian child, they do have to be unmarried under 18. And if they're eligible for enrollment in a tribe, they have to be the child of an enrolled member as well. And so there are times when we get notification about a Potawatomi family and mom is not enrolled yet, but grandpa is. Well, we help mom get enrolled. That way we can become involved. And in order for ICWA to apply, the child has to meet those criteria. And then ICWA directs states to prioritize placing American Indian children with American Indian family members before non-American Indian family members. And that answer is actually false, but we had 91% of respondents say that that was true. But the correct answer is, while ICWA does prioritize placement of Indian children with relatives, it does not prioritize placement with American Indian relatives. And so each tribe can set their own preferences. So at Citizen Potawatomi Nation, our preferences are different than are what's said in ICWA. But when I worked at Chickasaw Nation, our preferences were the same as ICWA. And so with each tribe, you have to check. And so I see a great question here, and I'd like to save that for the end, Farina, if you don't mind, because I think that is a really great question to wrap up with. And so then I'd asked them about their experience with training and what they learned. And so I asked if they learned about placement preferences. 56% said yes, 20% said no, and 22% were unsure. If they learned about reasonable and active efforts. And I will tell you here, the trainings that the majority of respondents said they attended do not offer this. And so even though 63% said yes, that data is really a little bit skewed, and they may just be attributing that learning to something else. Like maybe they learned it in a different training, but most likely they did not learn that in their pre-service. And then same things for American Indian tribes. And then I asked if they learned about the reason ICWA was enacted by Congress. And then I wanted to find out how effective do they feel like the ICWA training was. And so we had a small percentage that said extremely effective. And we have had quite a few families who had not yet cared for an Indian child. And so a lot of those respondents said this answer, because really it is effective if it hasn't impacted you. And then very effective was 29%, and moderately effective was the same. And so really what you want to see in the effectiveness of a training when you're evaluating it is more responses, at least at moderately and higher. We don't really want to see 17% not at all effective. And the data on the next slide is really similar in their responses. Do they feel like they were effectively prepared to take care of these children, meet their cultural needs, and connect them to their tribe? And we had 22% that said not all effective. So that went up a little bit. So that definitely stood out to me when I was reviewing my survey results. And the suggested improvements from respondents. So I asked them, do they believe they were given enough information about fostering and adopting American Indian children? Over half do not believe they were given enough information. Again, when we're looking at a training and evaluating it, you want to see a lot higher numbers of effectiveness and that they feel like they received training. So for sure, we see an issue there that we want to help with. And so I wanted to share, there's several quotes on the next slides, and I wanted to share a few of them. And so the adequacy of information provided. So like, do you feel like it was adequate? And so the quotes that I've selected represent a sampling of really an overall picture of what most people were saying. And so the first respondent said, I feel we were adequately informed. However, it's amusing that we were told none of this would probably pertain to us since we were not American Indian. Yet 4 of our 9 foster kids have been American Indian. So that is a great example. There are often times that a foster adoptive parent, they're not American Indian, but they are called to take care of children that are, or the Indian heritage is identified after placement. And that does happen pretty often, especially if a child is not identifiably Native, in what people would say. We also, the next person said, I feel we were given enough info considering we weren't planning on fostering American Indian children. But as you recall, 83% of our respondents are non-American Indian, yet over 63% had fostered American Indian children and a portion had adopted them. So it's pretty much inevitable in Oklahoma that you may foster or adopt American Indian child. And also the first quote here, I don't remember any training on how to connect tribal children with their heritage because we were basically told not to accept tribal children if you're not a tribal home. And again, you can't always control that if their heritage is identified later. And then we had some people say that there really wasn't information about ICWA in their training. It was skimmed over. And then this last person, they felt like the child they received was only 2 days old, so they didn't know anything about culture. And suggestions for improvement, we had several talk about they wanted to know more about things like haircutting and ceremonies, things that are important to biological families and children, but maybe foster parents don't know about. We had quite a few that they felt like they wanted the tribe to be more involved in the training. And then also people that just wanted to know basics, they wanted to know the basics about ICWA. They think there's a lot of bad information out there, and having this information there in training would help clear up some of those fears that foster adoptive parents have in Oklahoma. And quit asking about race. So we had a couple comments like that. So that kind of represents, I'm not really sure why they took the survey. It was voluntary. So if they didn't want to talk about race or ethnicity, they probably shouldn't have taken the survey. But you know, that feedback is still really valuable to see people's views on ICWA. This one was really great. The training mostly focused on behavior problems, but not the legal side of fostering. And so again, what is ICWA? A law. And so of course there are other federal and state laws that do impact foster care and adoption. And so I thought that was a really great suggestion and good insight from a foster adoptive parent. And then the last quote here, there's so much info in the training, it's hard to digest it all. So that was really good to see as well, because when we talk about, we want to incorporate more ICWA training, it's like, okay, how much is too much? How much is too little? How much is enough for them to get something out of it and remember it? So those are really got me thinking as reading these suggestions. Any Indian child we have, the parents did not keep them connected to the culture. So I'm confused on why they should be if they were not raised that way. And so this is great, because if you don't have knowledge about Indian separation, removals, forced family separation, illegal foster care and adoptions, the impact of these family separations, substance abuse, neglect, mental health, if you don't have knowledge of all of this, you definitely will be confused on why children were not raised in their culture. I think that, you know, that's like, this is a very valid statement, and I was very appreciative that they shared that. And then the last person said, if I didn't work for child welfare, I may have not received additional training regarding ICWA. And as far as how many people showed backlash, there were several, and I'm not saying they were necessarily disrespectful. It was just more, they're like, I don't really care about this topic. So there was a lot of indifference, but and I do have a quote to share with you next, which was, children are children and being Indian doesn't matter. And so just take a moment to kind of let that sink in. It was kind of haunting to read as I was mining through my data. I was a little shocked, but, you know, not having training about ICWA, tribes, or the children, or the importance of it, you could see how someone doesn't realize that it matters, but obviously it does. And so this, you know, I felt like this had to live on its own slide, because we don't want foster adoptive parents to think that a part of a child's identity, culture, and heritage does not matter. And so I did come up with recommendations to improve the pre-service training. Again, we only had a 53% rate of people or that answered the questions correctly about ICWA. So we know we need to improve their knowledge about ICWA, right? So that's step one. And so some of the information that should be included, and this is based off my professional knowledge, as well as mainly like what the foster and adoptive parents ask for about the effort. So understanding about how removal should be prevented by states and the efforts they have to make to reunify families. Good cause hearings, findings, and other legal proceedings. So there are a lot of hearings within an ICWA case that are not within a non-ICWA case. And so a foster parent really should be able to understand that, how it could change the course of a case, or it could impact the length of a case even. Also explaining why placing children with their family and in native homes is in the long-term best interest of children. So often as a foster adoptive parent, you just love, foster adoptive parents have big hearts. That's why they open their home. They want to take care of kids. They don't really care a lot of the time what race they are, ethnicity, their heritage, what they look like, if they're tall, short, skinny, chubby. They just want to love a child, but they have to understand that even if you've taken care of a child for a period of time, in the long term, they really need to be within the placement preferences, which is family and within their tribe. And also recommending for like what it is like to work with the tribe, like for a foster parent to know the level of tribal involvement. We do intervene legally into cases as a legal party. We make recommendations. We place children in our tribal homes. We do home visits. Every tribe is different on their level of involvement. Some of that is due to staffing, but they need to understand that tribes will be involved if there is an Indian child. And then also just how to care for the needs of these children. And then a video that amplifies the voice of a multitude of professionals was recommended as well. And this will allow the law to be humanized, as well as the people that are working within the law to be humanized. Often when people refer to the tribe, I don't think they think of us as a group of people or a family. We're like an entity, and that's really not what an Indian child welfare program is, and it's not what a tribe is. And so then just other recommendations is just we really need to work together as partners with OKDHS to recruit more American Indian families. And so there have been these efforts over the years. We just need to continue that partnership. There's so many wonderful built-in meetings and committees and partnerships that we have with OKDHS and tribes, and we just really need to build upon that so that we can find more families. Also, we talked about pre-service training, but that continuing education. So 60% said they had received no training after their pre-service about ICWA. And so we want to continue that. And also for OKDHS to arrange for tribal consultation so we can talk about ICWA training, and then ongoing collaboration with tribes to protect our most valuable resource, our children. They are our future. So these are the recommendations that I actually presented to OKDHS. And so just to give you a short timeline of that, I did present my final research project in January at the MPLD fellowship graduation. And so that was really just culmination of my research project and talking about leadership training. And then the next week, just a few days later, I met with the assistant director of OKDHS, Trish Howe. And we talked about, I'd shared with her about my project, and we really kind of had a lot of common values about support foster care or foster parents should receive, as well as training. And so just a couple days after that, I presented to her executive leadership team, and I gained that commitment to improve ICWA training. So that's pretty cool because in my fellowship program, I'm actually the only person wanting another agency to change something within their operations. Pretty much everyone else their project was within their own organization, whether it be a state DHS or a private organization. So I was like pleasantly surprised at how easy it was, but having those long-standing relationships with OKDHS has really been a valuable tool because they understand that as tribes, we want to help our families. And then as far as moving forward with the creation of the training and implementing it, I'm currently working with the foster care and adoptions field team. And so I'm working with Lacey Krantz and Robert Williams, and Rob is actually a Cherokee citizen. So that's been really great to work with him. And so what we've done, we created a plan. We're going to move forward. We're going to create this new ICWA training, and it's going to be incorporated into the current guiding principles training. And until NTDC rolls out statewide in September 2022, it will be in guiding principles as soon as we get it developed, and that's in process, and it will be in the NTDC training as well. So Oklahoma foster adoptive parents are going to receive this training about ICWA purpose active efforts, all of those recommendations that I've made throughout this presentation. The in-service training, it would be more in depth. And so when we think about a pre-service foster adoptive parent training, it's very lengthy. They're spending time doing paperwork, getting home visits, going to training. It's 27 hours. So we have to like be realistic and know that also the trainers are not experts on ICWA. The pre-service trainers, many have child welfare experience, but they're not necessarily anyone that's ever worked with an ICWA case or in a child welfare program. And so the in-service training would be more in depth, and that's where we could really answer a lot more questions about logistics and legalities of ICWA. And so the tribal-led creation of a video featuring ICW staff is what we ended up deciding on. So we can talk about why ICWA was created and why it's still important today. And again, touch on those pieces of why is our culture lost in so many instances, and how are we working to regain that. And there's also a website called Oklahoma Fosters that is going to be like a hub for foster care adoption information and resources. And we want to have tribal pages so that each tribe can add their own information about history, culture, and language. At Citizen Potawatomi Nation, we do include cultural boxes. We send this to every child that gets placed into foster care, and it has information about language, has language video games. We have the Noak Nishomasuk or Seven Grandfather teaching story. We have a story about how Wabozo or Rabbit's tail got short, and we even give them a bunny so that when they read the story, they can hold their bunny. And so we just want to, whatever we can do to like get more information out there that's easily to access for foster adoptive parents, it's going to be important considering so many are non-native. And so, like I said, the next steps, we're developing our new ICWA material. And then the organization that is going to be developing the video is the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association. And so I'm the chair of the Substitute Care Committee, and we have been tasked with creating this video. So we were meeting in a couple of weeks, and we're going to go over essentially a storyline and kind of like what the timeline may look for this video, starting with, Indian removal, family separation, boarding school era, historical trauma, and building up to today and where we are today and why this is important for children. And so I did want to share a few pictures here. So this is my family. And so on the left here is my college graduation back in 2010. And I was being smudged with sage. And as I was being smudged, I was prayed for and prayed that I would be able to carry into the future as a professional and help families. And so I've been blessed to feel like this, keeping the sage burning is why I'm here today. And then I just had a few other pictures of my family as well. And as you look at these pictures, I just want you to remember that being Indian does matter, and keeping the sage burning matters as well. Miigwech. So I see a question in here, so I'm going to read that. To what degree do all involved in ICWA in these different capacities, positions, and roles learn about Indigenous specific histories and cultures? So that's a great question. In the past, there was not a lot of ICWA training for child welfare workers with the state, but there is an ICWA partnership grant that OICWA, the association I just mentioned, and OKDHS have been operating for, I think, about 4 years now. And with that, they are training their workforce. And so there is a unit in OKDHS called the Tribal Coordinators, and they have really like led charge with training across the state. And then so that's really increased a lot. And they learn about historical trauma, boarding schools, the things that you mentioned as well. As far as colonialism, I don't know that it goes deep into colonization as in the academic sense, but I know that that training is out there, and it's definitely been very helpful for DHS workers to learn about. And they've been able to attend the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Association annual conference for the last few years through scholarships. And so we've had more OKDHS workers than ever that have been able to, we've been able to interact with them more in a conference setting, and they've been able to get this great training. And then how have recent lawsuits and court cases affected your work? Obviously, if you have seen the news, we have the Brackeen v. Holland. It was Brackeen v. Zinke, and it's been a couple Secretary of Interiors. But it definitely impacts our work. Right now, ICWA is not struck down. And so I want to preface this by saying I'm not a legal expert in any capacity. And if you were to want more information about the Brackeen case, please visit the NICWA website, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and review their Protect ICWA campaign. They have a lot of information with legal experts weighing in on that decision. But ICWA was not struck down. Portions of it were being called unconstitutional as far as placement, but ICWA as a whole was not. And then what have different groups done in support of ICWA and educating the general public? For sure. So NICWA and then OICWA, so our national organization and then our state organization provide training, like I mentioned, and NICWA is like an advocacy organization as well. And so they file legal briefs, they file amicus briefs, whatever they need to do to help ensure that ICWA and our families are protected, those steps are done. So if you'd like to support NICWA or OICWA, you can send me an email. My email is right here, and I can give you the steps on how to financially support or help in other ways as well. Are there any more questions that anyone has?
You guys can feel free to unmute or put your questions there in the chat. And I just want to say, wow, Kendra, I am shocked, by some of those responses. And it just points to the fact that we do need more American Indian families to step up as foster parents so that these children aren't put in situations where their identity and their cultural background is ignored or felt unimportant. And what I do want to say is that I hope that you feel empowered by the fact that your research is leading to change, and that is amazing.
Yeah, it's been a big blessing. And like I said, not that I was shocked, but I was surprised at how easy it was. But I think that, it helped that getting their support to survey their foster parents was a big step. But I think it shows the importance of tribal state collaborations and keeping good relationships. Despite differences, we've seen a lot of growth in our relationships with the state and Indian child welfare programs, and that's just going to continue, I think. And then as far as we're making this training change, they listen to their foster adoptive parents. And I think that says a lot about the state and their commitment to support their families and help support ICWA.
Absolutely. Elisa Douglas, you can't see her, but she's been listening into your presentation. She works at the Center for Tribal Studies and every year organizes an event in November around adoption and foster care. And so maybe we can bring you back or get some updates this year on your project and the change that's happening. And I just want to thank you for all of that hard work. And I don't know if there are any other questions, but I do want to point to the link in the survey that is in the chat. That's our evaluation for our session. It's very helpful to get your feedback. So please take a moment to copy and paste that link into your browser, or click on it so that you can provide your feedback. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Kendra, thank you so much. Mado, for sharing your research and again, for the work that you're doing to improve the child welfare for our Native children that are in the foster care system. So I was familiar with working with OCSA, the Oklahoma Successful Adulthood Program, and have set up tables and presented for several of their conferences that they do for youth transitioning out of foster care, into adulthood. And I attended a conference or an event, a one-day event that I think it might have been in Shawnee, where they, for Native foster youth, where they brought them in and they did teach them some things about their culture. But I don't know how individualized it was in terms of like a specific tribe. So that could be something that they can improve on as well, making that more specific. So it looks like there is a question: what type of methods have you found that help to educate families and other organizations during the time of COVID that you found to be helpful?
Yeah, so honestly, everything shifted to virtual. Like, it's been really easy. Pretty much all child welfare agencies and tribes have had access to Zoom or Teams. And so I would say that but really the biggest thing is being involved in state level organizations and partnerships. So like Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare, that is an avenue. It's been around for years, since like 1981, I think. It started out as a BIA, essentially like child protection team, and developed into what it is today. And so I think the best way to educate is being involved in organizations that already have relationships with those organizations and people that we want to train. But yeah, as far as COVID goes, really Zoom has been amazing, and we've been able to engage more with other tribes than we ever have before. So it's been great, a great resource to have. And then as far as the comment about being Indian doesn't matter, I mean, if someone were to share, I'm racist, yeah, that might be a concern when they're getting approved, but that's really not how it works. And again, a lot of people have feelings about ICWA and feelings about tribes because of a negative experience they've had as a foster parent or someone they know has. But really, it's just like I said, a miseducation in many instances. So that's why I feel like having this information before they get approved and then having it after is going to be vital so that they have the right mindset in fostering. As a foster parent, your goal is to take care of a child until they can transition to a permanent placement. That's not always you. It's really vital for sure to screen. So as part of my job here, I do screen and write home studies. I do literally do everything. I'm the only worker here that does foster care and adoption. And so I take that very seriously. But people slip through the cracks that aren't supportive or just become jaded. So, that's human nature.
Yeah, I can't imagine how difficult your job is. And I also didn't realize that the tribes have the ability to set their own preferences, their priorities when in placement. And so I learned a lot from your presentation today too, in that regard. So,
and we can apply those in state court as well.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Could I add something? I asked a lot of questions. I just want to say, so I'm a historian who focuses, I don't like really saying specializes, but focuses on histories of Indian child removal and specifically school histories. And I've written about it and published about it. And this conversation really makes me feel like, wow, we hold the National Endowment for Humanities holds institutes with teachers and educators trying to encourage more, Native American history in general, just the ignorance and marginalization of Native American experience and history. And this really interconnects with this, of the distortions and why, mascots are an issue, right? The image, the representation of Native Americans, as you said, even how people conceptualize tribe and homogenize it and don't really understand, the differences with like racial constructs and sovereignty and all these dynamics. You can't blame them because they've been fed these distorted, even myths and lies in some instances. So I really hope there can be some collaboration with scholars of, in this kind of programming that you're talking about on the website, maybe even conversations or such, meetings that could happen between scholars and intellectuals or people who know these histories and can share them in mediums. Like you said, you're working on videos and such like that. And Margaret Jacobs has worked, especially in this area of the history of Indian Child Welfare Act, but so many others, especially Indigenous scholars, of course. And I'm a citizen of Navajo Nation, and just the stories of my family and the considerations and knowing the distinctions, of each Indigenous community and how intricate that is so important. So I wanted to say that, and I hope stay in touch because I think this is such important work, and your survey reveals there's more work to do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the comment. Please feel free to email me if you'd like to connect after. And I see another question. So Amanda opened a foster care agency in Northwest Oklahoma. That's awesome. As far as like topics to focus on for non-native homes, I actually had a foster care agency in Weatherford, I think, or Clinton. I talked to a worker there yesterday, but I would say like ICWA, I mean, to understand the law, like this is federal and state law and policy. So it needs to be followed and give them the context of why. And also to just explain really about like what matters to a foster parent is placement a lot of the time. And so for them to understand what the placement preferences are and why those are important. And I think as far as tribes reluctant to work with non-native homes, that definitely can happen because of, foster parents will hire an attorney and take us to court over, again, it's federal, state law, and DHS policy. yet they just don't feel like it should apply. And again, it's because people have that understanding that it's a race-based law, even though it's not. And so that I think that's one issue is I would focus on that too, is like, this is based on a government to government relationship. Just as if a child in Canada that's an American citizen may come into care, they're going to have a relationship about that child. It's the same thing for Indian children. But the difference is the culture and the heritage that has been stripped away methodically and strategically over hundreds of years. And so those aren't just, it's not just as simple as, well, the tribe is involved. It's like, no, we're involved for a reason. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that history and understanding is so important to gain that context. And they're certainly not getting that in the public school system, right? To understand our histories.
That's another issue.
Right, right. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up now. Kendra, again, thank you so much for your presentation, for sharing this information, and for the work that you're doing. Thank you to everyone who has attended today, and we hope that you'll take time to fill out that survey and that you will take time to join us for sessions the rest of today and tomorrow, and then we have a film on Saturday. So good day to everyone. Mado.